Imagine a place where shadows are more than illusions, where the whispers you dismiss as the wind carry secrets buried long ago, stories of those who rest but never left. There are places in this world where time seems to pause, forgotten corners with overgrown grass, crumbling stones, and names etched by hands long turned to dust. And in one such place, hidden away from the world's busy eyes, lies a graveyard, abandoned and locked away by those who knew what dwelled within. This place carries a legacy, a history woven from fear, remorse, and whispers that cling to the air like a memory. Tonight, a man steps into this hidden world, unaware of the burden he's about to take on, of the gaze that awaits him in the silence. He is a night watchman, a solitary figure doing his rounds in a place most would rather forget. With a simple task to keep the peace in a place that knows only restless quiet, he walks among the tombstones. But as he steps closer, he doesn't yet realize that the air has thickened, that the quiet is listening, and that beneath his feet lies an ancient marker, a stone meant to warn those who dare draw close. What lies beyond this stone isn't merely the past. It's something far older, reaching out for a witness, or perhaps a companion. This story isn't about a simple encounter, it's about a place where those who wander too close may find themselves tangled in a web of shadows, voices, and restless souls who can't find peace. And tonight, for this watchman, that thin line between his world and theirs begins to dissolve. He took the job thinking it would be just another quiet night, a few hours spent in silence, maybe even a chance to enjoy the crisp, late autumn air. He didn't mind the cemetery. It was old, yes, but abandoned, left to the wild brush and creeping vines of years gone by. Nothing to guard but shadows and stones. And so on this Halloween night, he arrived, lantern in hand, his steps echoing against the worn path that wound through rows of ancient graves, like a line drawn through time itself. The cemetery stretched out before him, a sprawling field of uneven ground, peppered with tombstones, some as tall as a man, others cracked and sunken deep into the earth, barely visible. The stones were weathered, their inscriptions faded, some so old that the names and dates had worn away entirely, leaving only strange, eroded symbols that looked like ancient warnings more than epitaphs. Dead. Brittle trees twisted their skeletal branches over the graves, casting warped shadows that moved even when the wind did not stir. The bark peeled from the trees in strips, blackened and split, revealing pale wood beneath that gleamed ghostly in the dim light. The scent in the air was thick, earthy, a blend of damp moss, decaying leaves, and something more pungent, almost metallic. It clung to the back of his throat, making him cough softly, as if the air was somehow too heavy, too saturated with memories of what lay buried here. A cold breeze swept through the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of something forgotten, something ancient, stirring leaves in small, restless eddies along the ground. But it wasn't just the cold that made him shiver, it was the quiet, the kind of silence that settled like a weight, pressing in from all sides. Every sound he made seemed to echo and then disappear, swallowed up by the darkness. With each step he took, he felt it more, the sense of something watching, something hidden just beyond the reach of his lantern's glow. Shadows pooled between the stones, darkening with an unnatural depth that made him glance over his shoulder more than once, half expecting to see a face, a hand reaching out from the void. But there was nothing there, only the silence punctuated by the faintest whispers, so soft he could barely make them out, like breaths just beyond hearing. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself it was only the wind, but the whispers didn't fade. They lingered, curling through the air like smoke, slipping in and out of the silence, growing louder when he drew near the oldest part of the cemetery, where the graves were nothing more than sunken patches in the earth, and the stones bore no names, only strange, twisted symbols. The whispers followed him, coming from all directions, overlapping one another, a chorus of voices that seemed to be trying to tell him something he couldn't quite understand. The ground was uneven here, treacherous, and his steps grew cautious as he moved deeper into the cemetery, where the trees grew closer together, their branches woven like skeletal fingers, blocking out what little light the moon provided. The air was colder here, biting against his skin, and the smell of decay grew stronger, almost overwhelming. He could feel it in his lungs, a damp, rotting heaviness that clung to him, as if the cemetery itself was alive, breathing around him, filling his senses with its presence. Then came the footsteps, soft, echoing, almost perfectly in time with his own. He stopped, holding his breath, but the steps continued, 1, 2, 3, then silence. He spun around, lantern raised, its flickering light casting long shadows that stretched and shifted, giving the illusion of movement where there was none. The cemetery was empty, as still and silent as before, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone. The footsteps had been real, he was sure of it. They had sounded so close, as if someone had been right behind him, matching his every step, only to vanish when he turned. For a moment, he stood frozen, his eyes scanning the darkness, the distant tombstones looming like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. The whispers returned. Softer this time, more insistent, almost pleading. He strained to hear them, catching only fragments in name, a faint cry, words blurred by the passage of time. And with each whisper, he felt a chill, as if the air itself was laced with the memories of the dead, memories that clung to the stones, to the earth, waiting to be heard. The longer he stood there, the more he felt it, a presence, intangible but undeniable, pressing in on him, filling the air with a tension that made his skin prickle. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating in the stillness, a reminder of his own mortality in a place that had long since forgotten what it meant to be alive. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, but the quiet was relentless, weighing on him, filling his mind with questions, with doubts. Just as he began to turn away, something caught his eye, a faint, flickering glow near the oldest graves, barely visible in the darkness. It was there, then gone, like a will-o', the wisp leading him deeper into the shadows. His curiosity battled with his instinct to leave, to turn back and abandon this place, but the light drew him forward, compelling him to move, to see, to understand. With each step he took, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, overlapping voices echoing through the night, rising and falling like the wind. And as he approached the source of the light, he could feel it, a cold, hollow sensation in his chest, as if something within him recognized this place, this moment, a sense of familiarity that chilled him to the core. He was no longer just a watchman, he was a witness, a participant in a story that had been waiting, lingering in the shadows, calling him closer, closer to the heart of the cemetery, to the graves that held secrets older than he could fathom. Soft whispering intensifies, footsteps echo, rustling in the darkness. As he moved deeper into the heart of the cemetery, his lantern cast a dim glow over the stones, the light barely cutting through the thickening darkness. The whispers had grown faint, as though waiting, watching, choosing their moment to reemerge. He felt a strange pull guiding him, a subtle force he couldn't resist, leading him toward an ancient, moss-covered tombstone hidden beneath the twisted roots of an old oak tree. The stone was different from the others, larger, darker, and oddly pristine, despite its age, as if untouched by the decay that consumed everything else around it. The writing was etched deep, words cut with precision and care, though faded with time. As he leaned in, his fingers brushing the cold, damp stone, he could make out the words, "Let the dead remain in their rest. Disturb their slumber, and you shall join them." His hand recoiled, an involuntary reaction to the weight of those words, heavy with a warning that seemed less like superstition and more like a promise. A chill crept up his spine as he recalled stories from his childhood, tales whispered among the townsfolk of how years ago, a group of curious locals had dared to dig too close, had disturbed graves that had been sealed with care and respect. It had been said that one by one, those who had ventured into the depths of this cemetery fell victim to strange accidents, freak illnesses, unexplainable deaths. The tales were old, passed down like folklore, but standing here now, with the cold stone beneath his fingers, they felt like truth. The air grew heavier, dense with a foreboding silence that wrapped around him like a shroud. He tried to shake off the feeling, to tell himself that these were only stories, warnings meant to keep children from trespassing. But as he stood there, his heart pounding, he couldn't escape the feeling that he had just crossed an unseen boundary, that he had become part of the legend he had dismissed as mere rumor. Then he heard it, a whisper, soft and distant at first, like the rustling of leaves, but with a clarity that made him freeze. His name, drifting on the breeze, spoken with a voice that was neither male nor female, neither old nor young. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, an echo that wrapped around him, tugging at his thoughts, pulling him deeper into its grasp. He stood still, listening, his pulse thundering in his ears as the voice grew louder, repeating his name with a chilling familiarity. His breaths came shallow, his skin prickling with a cold sweat as he turned, searching the shadows, his lantern held high, its light trembling as if in fear. The whispers were all around him now, overlapping, rising and falling. Voices he couldn't place, voices that seemed to come from the very ground beneath his feet. And then, just as the sound became overwhelming, he felt it, a cold, feather light touch on his shoulder, pressing down with a weight that was both gentle and terrifying, like a hand reaching out from beyond, making contact across a boundary that should never have been crossed. He spun around, heart pounding, the light of his lantern flaring across the tombstones, casting wild, jagged shadows that twisted and shifted, but there was no one there. Just silence, an unbroken, suffocating silence. His breath caught in his throat as he glanced down, his gaze falling to the soft earth behind him. Fresh footprints. Clear, unmistakable, leading directly to where he stood, pressed deep into the mud, as if made only moments ago. They weren't his. They didn't match the tread of his boots, didn't follow the path he'd taken. They seemed to emerge from nowhere, stopping inches behind him, exactly where he had felt the touch. The lantern flickered in his hand, casting eerie shadows over the footprints, each one sharp and clear, yet impossible. His mind raced, searching for explanations for logic, but none of it made sense. He was alone, wasn't he? His thoughts faltered, doubt creeping in as he tried to steady his breathing, to convince himself that his mind was only playing tricks. But the cold still lingered on his shoulder, like a memory etched into his skin, a reminder that he was no longer alone, that something had reached out to him, if only for a moment. He took a shaky step back, his eyes fixed on the footprints, on the soft indentation of each step, and he realized that the whispers had fallen silent, as though waiting, holding their breath along with him. He knew he should turn and leave, that he should abandon this place and the ghosts that clung to it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had already been marked, that this night was no longer his to escape. And as he stood there, teetering between fear and fascination, he heard the whisper again, softer this time, close to his ear, as if someone were standing right beside him, leaning in, waiting for him to listen. "You've come too close." His blood ran cold, his pulse thundering in his ears as he tried to pull himself back to reality, to remind himself that he was alone. But the words lingered, seeping into his thoughts, settling like a weight on his chest, a reminder that some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Just as he began to turn, ready to retreat from the depths of this haunted ground, he noticed something glinting in the mud beside the footprints, half buried beneath the dead leaves, a small, rusted locket, its delicate chain twisted and tangled as if it had been torn from someone's neck in a moment of desperation. He knelt, reaching out with trembling fingers, and as he touched it, the whispers surged again, filling the air with a chorus of voices, pleading, warning, demanding that he leave it be. But he couldn't look away. The locket felt cold, unnaturally so, its metal biting into his skin as he lifted it, feeling its weight, its history. He could sense the presence of its owner, an energy that clung to it like a shadow, a sense of longing and loss that tugged at him. And as he held the locket in his hand, the whispers grew louder, overlapping, rising to a fevered pitch, filling his mind with fragmented images of a darkened room, a candle flickering, a figure standing alone, waiting, watching the shadows. He could almost feel the emotions, the desperation, the fear, the helplessness of the one who had left this token behind. A soul trapped in a moment that had stretched on for decades, perhaps even centuries. The cold settled deeper into his bones, chilling him to the core, and he realized that he had been drawn into something far beyond his understanding, that he had crossed into a story that was never meant for the living. And as he looked down at the locket in his hand, he knew, with a certainty that filled him with dread, that he was no longer just an observer. He had become part of the tale, a new chapter in a story that had been waiting, lingering in the shadows, for someone foolish enough to listen. The whispers intensify, footsteps echo, and the sound of rustling leaves fills the silence. The camera lingers on the locket, and then slowly pans to the empty footprints behind the protagonist as the screen fades to black. The locket felt cold and heavy in his palm, a relic of a past that seemed to cling to the present, drawing him deeper into the mystery that surrounded the abandoned graves. He wanted to believe that he could walk away, that whatever force lay within this place would release him if he let the locket fall back to the ground. But something had changed, a bond had formed, a connection that felt as inevitable as it was irreversible. He slipped the locket into his pocket, its weight pressing against him like a reminder of the choice he'd made, and continued his rounds, lantern casting long, wavering shadows across the stones. But now, with each step, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, followed, not by one presence but by many, as if the dead themselves were walking beside him, whispering, murmuring secrets meant to stay buried. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. A figure stood motionless near a tall, weathered tombstone. She was shrouded in a dark, tattered veil, her form barely visible beneath layers of faded funeral attire that looked as though it had been pulled from the depths of the earth. Her head was bowed, her hands folded, as if in mourning. The air around her seemed colder, stiller, as though even the night had recoiled from her presence. He turned, heart racing, stepping closer, the lantern's light cutting through the darkness. But as he drew near, she faded like smoke, her form dissolving into the shadows, leaving nothing but the empty space where she'd stood. The whispers intensified, swirling around him in an unbroken circle, filling the silence with their mournful chant, each voice layered with a sorrow that felt ancient and unending. He moved slowly, feeling an inexplicable pull to follow her, though his instincts told him to leave, to run. The cemetery felt different now, the familiar paths twisted and distorted, as though the very ground had shifted beneath him. And then he saw it again, a flash of movement, a fleeting glimpse of her figure hovering near another grave, her face hidden beneath the veil, her hands reaching out, pleading. As he rounded the corner, his lantern's light fell upon a piece of paper, torn and weathered, pinned to a stone with a rusty nail. The handwriting was barely legible, scrawled in a desperate, trembling script. To those who find this, heed my warning. Leave this place. Do not disturb the silence of the dead, or they will never let you go. A chill washed over him as he read the words, a creeping sense of dread that settled into his bones. But something else caught his attention, a second note, half hidden beneath a crumbling headstone. He knelt, lifting the brittle paper, the ink smeared and faded, yet the message clear. She watches, she waits, do not follow her. The realization sank in, slow and terrifying. He was not the first to see her, to be drawn in by her ghostly presence. Others had come before him, had walked these paths and glimpsed the same spectral figure. And yet, none of them had stayed. The cemetery was empty, abandoned, as if the whispers had claimed all who dared linger too long. His breath quickened, heart pounding as he stumbled back, feeling the weight of countless eyes upon him, each gaze pressing down, filling him with a growing sense of unease. The whispers had changed. They were no longer soft murmurs, but insistent, urging him to leave, to turn back. And then the voices shifted. They were no longer just around him, they were inside his head, threading through his thoughts, whispering secrets of the dead, fragments of lives once lived, stories of those who lay beneath the earth. He heard names, dates, snatches of conversations, pleas for help, cries of sorrow and regret, each voice overlapping, blending into a cacophony of memories that filled his mind, threatening to drown out his own thoughts. It was as though the cemetery itself was alive, a collective consciousness of those buried beneath, their spirits reaching out, desperate for recognition, for release. And in the center of it all was the woman, her presence like a dark star, pulling him deeper into her orbit, binding him to her with each step, each whisper. He staggered forward, barely aware of his own movements, drawn to her like a moth to flame. She appeared again, closer this time, her face still obscured by the veil, but he could feel her gaze upon him, cold and unyielding. She extended a hand, fingers pale and ghostly, reaching for him, as if offering a chance to join her, to understand the secrets she held, to become part of the darkness that surrounded them. Another note caught his eye, pinned to a nearby tree, the words scrawled in an almost frantic hand. There is no peace here. The dead are restless, bound to this ground by deeds long forgotten. Turn back while you still can. But he knew, deep down, that it was already too late. The cemetery had claimed him, had woven him into its story, into its web of sorrow and loss. He could feel it, a cold, creeping certainty that settled in his chest, spreading through his veins like ice. He was part of the tale now, a witness to the whispers, to the lingering spirits that could not let go. And as he stood there, the whispers rose to a fevered pitch, filling the air with 1,000 voices, each one calling his name, demanding that he stay, that he listen, that he understand their pain. The woman moved closer, her veil lifting slightly, revealing eyes that held centuries of sorrow, of longing, eyes that seemed to see straight through him, to the very core of his soul. He felt his resolve crumble, his thoughts unraveling, replaced by the whispers, by the endless, echoing memories of the dead. They surrounded him, their shadows merging with his own, until he could no longer tell where he ended, and they began. His vision blurred, the cemetery dissolving into a haze of gray and shadow, a place where time and reality held no meaning. And in the midst of it all, he heard her voice, clear and unmistakable, rising above the chorus of whispers. You are one of us now. I am bound to this place, cursed to wander these graves. I disturbed the dead for greed, and now I am one of them. Beware, for if you hear the whispers, you are already claimed." A chill settled deep in his bones as he heard the words, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel her presence beside him, a silent witness to her own tale of sorrow and regret. She had disturbed a grave once, a single act of greed, and now she was chained to this place, her spirit doomed to wander the cemetery, forever warning others of the fate that awaited them. She had tried to leave, to escape the grip of this cursed ground, but every attempt had brought her back, had tightened the invisible chains that held her. And now he was bound as well. A deep, raw fear surged within him, the kind of fear that struck at the core of human nature, the fear of confinement, of isolation, of being trapped in a place where the line between life and death no longer mattered. His breaths came faster, each one echoing in the silence, a reminder of the life he could feel slipping away with each step he took. He was alone, surrounded by the dead, bound to a place that had no intention of letting him go. He took a step back, his gaze fixed on the woman, on the sorrow that radiated from her, the despair etched into her every movement. And as he looked at her, he felt a connection, a bridge between them forged by shared fate, by the realization that he too was now a prisoner of the cemetery. She had been young, perhaps his age, driven by a need for money, a single, desperate choice that had cost her everything. He could almost feel her emotions as though they were his own, the regret, the isolation, the unending loneliness of being a ghost among graves. As he stood there, trying to process the enormity of what lay before him, he felt it again, a presence far darker, far more ancient than anything he had yet encountered. The whispers grew fainter, retreating, as though something deeper, something older had risen to take their place. The very air grew cold, thickening, pressing in around him with a weight that felt suffocating. And he realized, with a mounting dread, that the woman was not the only force haunting this graveyard. She was merely a symptom, a shadow of a far greater darkness. In the silence that followed, he heard a voice, low, deep, echoing from beneath the ground itself, vibrating through the earth, through the tombstones, through the very air around him. It was a voice that defied age, that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, a voice not meant for the ears of the living. "You have come too close," it whispered, each word dragging out, filled with a malice that sent a chill through his veins. "She is bound to this ground, but I am bound to no place." He felt his hands tremble, his lantern flickering as the darkness seemed to pulse, as though alive, as though watching. He tried to turn, to run, but every path seemed blocked, twisted, leading him back to that same grave, to that same spot. He was trapped, caught in a web woven by forces that he could barely comprehend, forces that had lurked in the shadows long before he had set foot in this cursed ground. And in that moment, he understood this wasn't just a haunting. This was something far more sinister, far older than any spirit or ghost. He had stumbled upon a force not of this world, a presence that lived within the very fabric of the cemetery, something that fed on the souls of the lost, the desperate, the curious. The whispers had only been an invitation, a lure to draw him closer, to ensnare him in a darkness far deeper than he had imagined. The pale woman turned, her gaze meeting his, a sorrowful warning in her eyes, as though pleading with him to understand, to leave while he still could. But he knew, even as the thought crossed his mind, that escape was impossible. He was bound to this place, tied to the darkness that lingered just beyond sight, a prisoner of a force that defied time, reason, and mercy. The woman's form began to fade, her outline blurring into the shadows, her figure dissolving as though she were being pulled back, reclaimed by the curse that held her. And as she vanished, he felt a hollow emptiness settle over him, a sense of finality that chilled him to his core. There, alone in the heart of the cemetery, he felt the full weight of his fate pressing down on him, the knowledge that he too was now bound to ground, a part of the legend, a shadow among the graves. And as the whispers resumed, weaving through the silence, he knew they were no longer calling him by name. They were welcoming him. He sank down by the base of an old oak tree, its twisted roots curling through the earth like the gnarled hands of forgotten souls reaching from below. The cool, damp bark pressed against his back, grounding him, giving him a moment's respite from the whispers, the visions, and the oppressive weight of the cemetery. He took a deep breath, feeling a faint sense of relief wash over him as he repeated his silent promise to respect the dead, to leave them undisturbed, to never return to that cursed tombstone. The air felt lighter, calmer, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to close his eyes, to believe that the terror was finally over. Perhaps he had misunderstood, had stirred something that could be quieted with respect, with distance. A graveyard was just a resting place for the dead, after all a sacred ground, not a trap. He clung to this hope, feeling his heart beat slow, his breaths becoming steady once more. But as he settled into the stillness, a sound reached his ears, a soft, broken cry, distant but unmistakable, shattering the fragile calm he'd only just found. His eyes snapped open, his pulse quickening again as he turned his head, searching the shadows. The cry came again, softer this time, almost like a whimper, the kind of sound that carried with it a weight of grief, of despair that time could not erase. He sat up, scanning the darkness, when suddenly he felt a presence beside him, so close he could feel the chill radiating from it. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat, and there she was, the woman, her face pale and sorrowful, her eyes hollow, gazing at him with a knowing sadness. She was close enough to touch, her form clearer than ever, as though she were stepping from the shadows and into his reality. She leaned in, her face inches from his, her cold breath brushing against his cheek, and whispered in a voice laced with pain, "You're just like the others." The words sent a shock through him, a realization that shattered any illusion of safety he'd clung to. He wasn't an intruder here because he'd disturbed a grave. He hadn't simply broken a rule or crossed a line. No, it was worse than that, far worse. He understood now with a clarity that struck fear deep into his soul. This was never about trespassing on sacred ground or disrespecting the dead. This was about bearing witness. The curse wasn't tied to the act of disturbance. It was the knowledge, the understanding, the knowing of this place's dark secrets. Those who learned of the cursed dead, who saw the faces of the restless spirits, who heard the whispers and lived to tell the tale, were bound to become a part of it, to be woven into the cemetery's tale, just as she had been. She looked at him with an intensity that pierced through him, her gaze filled with sorrow, as if she could see his fate laid out before him, as if she had watched it unfold time and time again. She reached out, her hand hovering above his, cold as ice, not touching but close enough that he felt the chill seeping into his skin, into his bones. "You're just like them," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper, a ghostly echo of regret. They came, they saw, and they could never leave. He felt a wave of horror rising within him as the weight of her words sank in. He wasn't just trapped in this place. He was bound to it, tied by the same curse that had ensnared her and countless others before him. He'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, had opened his mind to secrets that had sealed his fate. The cemetery had claimed him, not because he'd violated its sanctity, but because he'd learned its story, had heard the whispers of those who could never leave. In a desperate attempt to break free, he stumbled to his feet, heart pounding as he turned, looking for a path, any path that might lead him away. But the shadows had closed in, the paths winding, twisting, leading him back to the same spots, the same tombstones, as though the cemetery itself were folding around him, sealing him inside. He heard her voice again, soft and distant, echoing from all directions, mingling with the whispers that rose from the ground, from the stones, from the very air around him. "You will join us," she said, her tone a mixture of sorrow and finality. "You are part of the story now." And in that moment, he felt the grip of the cemetery tighten, felt his own mind slipping, the memories of his life beyond the graves fading, becoming shadows, fragments of a reality he could no longer touch. The whispers grew louder, each one calling his name, welcoming him into the endless night, into the shadows, into the cold embrace of the cursed dead. And as he stood there, paralyzed by fear, he realized with dawning horror that he could no longer remember his way out, could no longer remember the world beyond the cemetery gates. All that remained were the shadows, the whispers, and the cold, endless night. The night felt endless, a void that stretched on with no hint of dawn. He stumbled through the cemetery, each step heavier, slower, as if he were sinking into the very ground beneath him. The whispers had grown, each voice distinct, yet blending together in a dissonant harmony that filled his mind, drowning out his own thoughts, pulling him deeper into a trance. He no longer felt fully awake, yet he could not rest. His eyes remained wide, his pulse steady but weak, like an echo fading with each beat. He felt a strange pull guiding him toward the far end of the cemetery, to a corner he hadn't noticed before, where the tombstones were more densely packed, leaning together as though in a mournful gathering. His lantern flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. He tried to avert his gaze, but it was as if the shadows themselves compelled him, pulling him forward, deeper into their embrace. And then he saw a tombstone, freshly carved, its edges sharp, the stone unweathered by time or decay. His breath caught as he stepped closer, the lantern's glow illuminating the inscription. His own name was etched into the stone, each letter cut with a precision that left no doubt. His full name, his date of birth, and the date of death, tonight. A tremor ran through him as he read it again and again, each time feeling the words tighten around him like a noose. He wanted to scream, to deny it, to run, but his feet remained planted, frozen in horror, as though the ground itself had claimed him. The whispers rose, louder now, filling the silence with a chant, a murmur of voices, each one urging him to accept his fate, to join them, to lie down and rest. The words burrowed into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. He felt an overwhelming urge to lay down, to surrender, to let the cold earth cradle him. His eyelids grew heavy, his vision darkening at the edges, and he felt a strange calm wash over him, an acceptance that he couldn't fight any longer. He took a step toward the grave, then another, his body moving with a will of its own, as though he had always belonged here, as though the grave had been waiting just for him. But as he lowered himself to the ground, lying back against the cold, damp earth, something stirred at the edge of the cemetery, a faint light cutting through the darkness. He forced his eyes open, his gaze drifting toward the source of the light, and he saw a figure entering the cemetery, a flashlight sweeping through the tombstones, a silhouette moving cautiously, calling his name. He jolted upright, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat of panic. Sweat clung to his skin as he tried to shake of the remnant of the nightmare that had gripped him. The dream had been so vivid, a suffocating black void. He looked at who had woken him, and it was a woman, his sister to be exact. Turns out he was screaming in his sleep. He could still feel the weight of darkness, the cold earth cradle him, could still hear the whispers, the voices fading away. The helplessness and sheer terror he felt in the dream gave him shivers. He looked out his window and saw a shadow like the one of the woman in his dream. He blinks and the shadow is no longer there. As he got ready for the Halloween party, all he could ask himself was if it was really just a dream.
Hey, enjoyed the haunting tale of Whispers from the Grave? Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to join our community of thrill seekers and never miss out on more spine-chilling stories. Stay spooky and keep the whispers alive.